"I'm your brother's bride." The Duke didn't blink. "Not since this morning." The carriage wheels found every rut and stone in the long drive leading to Thornfield Abbey, each jolt sending Rosalind's heart further into her throat. She pressed her gloved hand against the worn leather seat and tried to breathe steadily, watching through the rain-streaked window as the great house emerged from the October mist like a ship sailing out of fog. It was larger than she had imagined, larger and older and more imposing, all grey stone and Gothic windows, towers rising at each corner as if the original builders had expected siege rather than society. The grounds stretched endlessly in every direction, lawns and ancient oaks, formal gardens gone dormant for autumn, a lake glinting silver in the weak afternoon light. This was wealth on a scale Rosalind had only read about in novels, the kind of wealth that built hospitals and endowed universities and changed the course of nations. And as of this morning, she was connected to it by marriage. Mrs. Edmund Ashworth. She tried the name again in her mind, as she had been trying it all through the journey from London. It still didn't fit quite right, like a borrowed dress that pinched in unexpected places. But it would fit eventually. Everything became comfortable with time and practice. She touched the marriage lines folded carefully in her reticule, the paper already soft from how many times she had unfolded it to confirm the words were real. Married this day, October the 14th, 1815, Edmund Charles Ashworth to Rosalind Ann Blackwood. The vicar had been an elderly man with a persistent cough, the church small and empty, save for 2 witnesses pulled from the street. Edmund had apologized for the haste, for the lack of flowers and music and family. "My brother and I are estranged," he'd explained, his handsome face clouded with old pain. "But once he sees I've married a respectable woman, once he meets you, everything will be mended. You'll be the bridge between us, darling. You'll heal my family." It was a heavy responsibility to place on a former governess with 2 worn dresses to her name. But Rosalind had never shrunk from responsibility. It was all she had ever been good at, really being useful, being steady, being the person who solved problems rather than caused them. The carriage slowed as they approached the great front entrance, and Rosalind took a final moment to compose herself. She smoothed the skirt of her brown wool travelling dress, her best dress, her only good dress, the one she had been saving for church Sundays and potential interviews. Her hair was pinned as neatly as she could manage without a proper mirror, and her face was pale but presentable. She looked, she hoped, like a gentleman's wife, like someone who belonged in a place like this. She absolutely did not look like someone who had spent the last 6 years teaching other people's children while desperately saving coins against the workhouse. She did not look like someone who had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count, wondering if this scraping, grateful, precarious existence was all her life would ever be. That life was over now. Edmund had chosen her, and she had chosen safety, and together they would build something stable and good. The carriage door opened. A footman in immaculate livery stood waiting, his face professionally blank, despite what must have been considerable surprise at the unexpected arrival of a lone woman in a hired hack. "I am Mrs. Edmund Ashworth," Rosalind said, pleased that her voice emerged steady. "I have come to see His Grace, the Duke of Thornfield. I believe he is expecting me." This last was not entirely true, but Edmund had assured her he would send word ahead, and surely he had. Surely. Something flickered across the footman's face. Surprise, quickly suppressed, but he offered his hand to help her down with perfect courtesy. "If Madam will follow me, I will inform His Grace of your arrival." The entrance hall was cavernous and cold, all marble floors and ancestral portraits staring down from panelled walls. Rosalind's practical boots echoed far too loudly as she followed the footman, and she found herself walking on tiptoe, trying to take up less space. This was a house that demanded grandeur from its occupants, that made ordinary mortals feel small and insignificant. No wonder Edmund had struggled here. He was warmth and charm and laughter. This place was winter-given architectural form. She was left in a small parlour that was clearly meant for tradespeople and other persons of uncertain status, comfortable enough, but lacking the grandeur she'd glimpsed in the entrance hall. A fire burned in the grate, which was considerate, and she stood as close to it as propriety allowed, warming hands that had gone cold from more than the October chill. Please let this go well. Please let him welcome me. Please let everything Edmund promised be true. The door opened. Rosalind turned, her prepared speech dying on her lips, because the man who entered was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone older, softer, more obviously ducal in the way of aging aristocrats who had run to fat and complacency. Edmund had described his brother as stern and unyielding, cold as the stone of the abbey itself, and she had pictured someone grey and withered, desiccated by his own rigidity. The Duke of Thornfield was none of those things. He was perhaps 30, tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who still rode hard and worked his estates with his own hands. His hair was dark, nearly black, touched with silver at the temples that seemed premature, given his age, as if worry had done what years had not. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp angles and strong bones, a face that might have been carved from the same grey stone as his ancestral home. But it was his eyes that arrested her, grey and penetrating, taking her measure in a single glance and apparently finding her wanting. He did not smile. He did not offer any of the social pleasantries that should have smoothed this awkward meeting. He simply looked at her, waiting, and the weight of that gaze made Rosalind feel like a bug pinned beneath glass. "Your Grace." She dropped into her best curtsy, the one she had practiced in her cramped London lodgings until her knees ached. "Thank you for receiving me. I am, that is to say, as of this morning, I have the honour to be—" She drew a breath and forced the words out. "I'm your brother's bride." The Duke didn't blink. "Not since this morning." For a moment, the words made no sense. They were English, certainly, and she understood their individual meanings, but arranged in that order they became incomprehensible. Not since this morning. What could that possibly mean? "I beg your pardon?" "You were my brother's bride for approximately 3 hours, the Duke said, his voice flat and cold as frozen iron. "The marriage was annulled by special petition before noon. The officiant was a defrocked clergyman with no legal authority to perform the ceremony. The license was forged. The witnesses were hired actors. The entire arrangement was, to be blunt, a fraud from beginning to end." The room tilted. Rosalind reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, her fingers closing on carved wood with desperate strength. "That's not possible." I have the marriage lines. It was a proper church, a proper ceremony, a proper fraud." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, which he set on the table between them with damning precision. "My solicitor has been monitoring my brother's activities for some time, given his unfortunate habit of running up debts in my name. When word reached me of his romantic pursuit, I had the matter investigated. The Reverend Bartholomew Crane, if that is even his name, was stripped of his orders in 1811 for performing irregular marriages. The church where you were married has been deconsecrated for years. The entire production was a theatrical performance, Miss Blackwood, and you were the only member of the audience." Miss Blackwood, not Mrs. Ashworth. The distinction cut like a knife. "No." The word came out as a whisper. "No. Edmund said he told me. Whatever my brother told you was a lie." The Duke's voice held no sympathy, no softening. "The scheme, as I understand it, was elegant in its cruelty. Edmund would marry you, a respectable young woman of genteel birth, a former governess with an unblemished reputation. He would then present you to me as his wife, forcing me to acknowledge the connection or be responsible for a young woman's ruin. Either I would be obligated to support you both, thus funneling money to Edmund indirectly, or I would refuse and be painted as a monster who abandoned his brother's innocent bride to destitution. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Rosalind stared at the document on the table, the proof of her ruin, laid out in neat legal Latin, and felt her entire world crumbling like wet sand. But I thought... Her voice broke. She hated that, hated the weakness of it, and she forced herself to continue. I believed. You believed what you wanted to believe. The Duke's tone was pitiless. A handsome man paid you attention. He offered you escape from an uncertain future. You did not ask too many questions because you did not want the answers. It was true. God help her, it was true. There had been signs, hadn't there? The haste of the courtship, the strange insistence on secrecy, the way Edmund's eyes had slid away from hers whenever she asked about meeting his family, his friends, anyone who might verify his stories. She had seen the signs and chosen to ignore them, because acknowledging them would mean surrendering the dream of safety that had kept her alive through 6 years of precarious survival. "Where is he?" she heard herself ask. "Edmund? Where is he now?" "Gone." The word fell like a stone. "He cleaned out your savings, I assume whatever modest sum you had set aside. Then he fled, likely to the continent, where he will drink and gamble until the money runs out. He has done this before, Miss Blackwood. You are not his first victim, merely his latest." Not his first. The words echoed in the hollow space where her hopes had been. She was not special. She was not even a person to him, merely a means to an end, a convenient pawn in a family game she had never known she was playing. "The woman before you was named Charlotte Merriweather." The Duke's voice had changed slightly, a rough edge beneath the ice. "She was the daughter of a curate, like yourself, unmarried, unprotected. When my brother tired of his scheme and abandoned her, she was left with nothing, no reputation, no prospects, no hope. She walked into a river 6 months later." Rosalind's hand flew to her mouth. "I have funded an investigation into Edmund's activities since then," the Duke continued, "but I was too late to prevent your entanglement. For that, I offer you my regret. But regret will not restore your reputation or recover your savings." Silence stretched between them. Rosalind became aware that she was shaking fine tremors running through her body that she could not control. She was ruined. Not actually ruined, in the way society meant the word, but effectively so. She had travelled alone to a bachelor household. She had claimed to be married to a man who had never been her husband. Her references from her last position were in Edmund's possession, along with her money and her naive belief that the world could be kind. She had nothing. She was nothing. "What am I meant to do?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper, stripped of all pride. "I have no money, no references, no family to return to. Where am I meant to go?" The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted in those grey eyes, a flicker of... what? Guilt? Responsibility? Perhaps merely the cold calculation of a man weighing his options. "That," he said, "is precisely the question." He turned away from her, moving to stand before the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the grey October light. For a long moment he said nothing, and Rosalind watched him, trying to read meaning in the rigid line of his spine. He was not entirely unfeeling, she sensed. The story of Charlotte Merriweather had cost him something to tell, but whatever compassion he possessed was buried deep, armoured against access. "Sit down," he said finally, without turning. before you collapse and cause a scene." It was not a kind invitation, but Rosalind's knees were threatening to buckle, and she sank into the nearest chair with profound relief. The fire's warmth reached her, slowly thawing the ice that had formed in her veins. She was still ruined. She was still alone. But she was warm and seated, and not yet thrown out into the rain. "I am responsible for this situation." The Duke's voice was quiet, almost thoughtful, as if he were working through a problem. "Not directly, but my failure to control my brother's activities has resulted in harm to an innocent person. Justice would suggest that some form of restitution is owed. I don't want charity." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she meant them. "I've never taken charity in my life. I've worked for everything I have, everything I had. I won't become some pensioner, living off guilt money because your brother is a monster." The Duke turned at that, and for the first time, something like interest crossed his features. "What would you have then, Miss Blackwood, if not charity?" "Employment." The answer came immediately, without thought, because it was the only answer she had ever known. "I was a governess before Edmund, before I made my error. I am well educated, experienced, and capable of references from my position before last, if not from my most recent one. If your Grace knows of any household seeking a governess, I would be grateful for a recommendation." "A recommendation?" The Duke's tone was flat. "You propose that I recommend, as a governess, a woman who arrived at my home claiming to be my brother's wife? A woman whose reputation, however unjustly, has been destroyed by association with a known scoundrel? What household precisely would welcome such a candidate?" Rosalind's chest tightened. He was right. Of course he was right. No respectable family would hire a governess with her history, even if that history was nothing but lies and victimhood. The world did not care about truth. It cared about appearances. "Then what do you suggest?" She heard the desperation creeping into her voice and despised herself for it. "The workhouse? The streets? I have no other options, Your Grace. I have nothing." The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then he moved to the door, opened it, and spoke quietly to someone waiting outside, a servant, presumably. When he closed it again, his expression had shifted, become more businesslike. "My sister died 3 years ago," he said, the words clipped and efficient. "She left behind a daughter, Patience, who has been in my care since. The child is 8 years old, intelligent, and entirely ungovernable. She has driven away 4 governesses in as many months. The most recent one departed last week, in tears, after Patience released a collection of garden snakes into her bedroom. Despite everything, a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Rosalind's face. She suppressed it quickly. "You are proposing that I become her governess. I am proposing that you accept a position for which you are qualified, in a household where your history is already known, and therefore cannot be used against you." The Duke's tone remained coolly practical. "You would have room and board, a reasonable salary, and the protection of this household's name. In exchange, you would care for my niece, and speak to no one of the circumstances of your arrival. The servants will be told that you are a distant connection, a cousin of some sort, recently bereaved, and in need of quiet occupation. It is not an elegant solution, but it has the virtue of being true enough to survive scrutiny." Rosalind stared at him. "You are offering me a position in your household, after everything. I am offering you a means of survival that does not require charity or sacrifice of dignity." A pause. "Though I will warn you that Patience has broken stronger spirits than yours. If you accept, you must understand that I will expect genuine effort, not mere presence. The child has suffered enough loss without adding another false attachment to her account." It was not kindness. It was not even sympathy. It was cold pragmatism, the clearing of an account that had never been his to carry. But it was also a lifeline, thrown to a drowning woman who had no right to expect rescue. "Why?" Rosalind heard herself ask. "Why offer me anything at all? You could turn me out. No one would blame you. I'm nothing to you less than nothing. Just another of your brother's messes to be cleaned up and forgotten." The Duke's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought she had pushed too far, that he would rescind the offer and cast her out into the October rain where she belonged. "Charlotte Merriweather was 22 years old," he said quietly. "She had a younger brother who worshipped her, and a mother who never recovered from the loss. I paid for her funeral because my brother would not. I gave money to her family because it was the least I could do, the very least, and it was not nearly enough." He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something human in those grey depths. "I will not have another woman's ruin on my conscience, because Edmund cannot be controlled. You may call it guilt if you wish. I call it responsibility." Rosalind's throat ached. She wanted to hate him for his coldness, his judgmental assumptions about her motives, the way he had laid out her failures with surgical precision. But she could not hate a man who blamed himself for his brother's sins, who paid for strangers' funerals, who carried the weight of dead women's ghosts. "I accept," she said. "The position. I accept." "Good." The Duke nodded once, briskly, as if concluding a business transaction. "Mrs. Crawford, our housekeeper, will show you to your quarters and explain the household arrangements. Dinner is served at 7. You will take your meals in the nursery with Patience until further notice. You will have Sundays free and every second Wednesday afternoon. Your salary will be paid quarterly. And the first quarter in advance consider it restitution for the funds my brother stole from you." "That isn't necessary." "It is necessary to me." His voice brooked no argument. "You will find Patience in the schoolroom. I suggest you introduce yourself before dinner. And Miss Blackwood." He paused at the door. "She will test you, rigorously and immediately. Do not let her win." Then he was gone, leaving Rosalind alone in the little parlour, with the fire crackling, and her entire world rebuilt on new and uncertain foundations. Mrs. Crawford was a small, brisk woman with grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She led Rosalind through the labyrinthine corridors of Thornfield Abbey with efficient speed, pointing out landmarks along the way, the library, the music room, the long gallery that connected the old wing to the new. "The governess's quarters are in the east wing," Mrs. Crawford explained, "near the nursery and schoolroom. You'll have your own sitting room and bedroom, modest but comfortable. The previous governesses found them adequate, though I'll own they didn't stay long enough to complain about the furnishings." "The snakes?" Rosalind asked. Mrs. Crawford's lips twitched. "Among other things. Miss Patience is a spirited child. She took her mother's death hard, and then her father's. He followed his wife within the year. They were that devoted, and now she's been moved from her family home to this great cold pile with an uncle she barely knows. It's no wonder she's angry. But understanding the cause doesn't make managing the effects any easier. Her uncle seems concerned for her welfare." "His Grace?" Mrs. Crawford paused to open a door, revealing a narrow staircase. "He loves that child more than he knows how to show. That's the trouble with the Ashworth men. They feel everything deeply and express nothing at all. His Grace's father was the same. Watched his wife die of consumption without shedding a single tear, then drowned himself in the lake 3 months later. They call it stoicism, but I call it a sickness of the heart." Rosalind filed this information away carefully. It explained something about the Duke's coldness, that impenetrable reserve. He was not unfeeling. He was armoured against feeling, and that was a very different thing. The governess's quarters were, as promised, modest but comfortable. A small bedroom with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe. A sitting room with a desk, a bookshelf, and 2 worn but cosy chairs before a fireplace. The windows looked out over a kitchen garden, winter bare but neatly tended. It was not grand, but it was private and warm and safe. 3 things Rosalind had learned never to take for granted. "I'll have your things sent up," Mrs. Crawford said, and then paused, embarrassment flickering across her normally composed features. "That is, I understand you arrived with only a small bag. The rest of my belongings were lost in transit." The lie came easily, smoother than the truth. "I'm afraid I have very little with me." "Well," Mrs. Crawford's voice softened, "we'll see what can be done about that. The previous governesses left behind a few things that might be altered to fit. You're a sensible size, at least." Rosalind's throat tightened at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't met Miss Patience." The housekeeper moved toward the door. "The schoolroom is down the hall, 3rd door on the left. His Grace suggested you introduce yourself before dinner. I suggest you brace yourself before you do." Left alone, Rosalind took a moment to collect herself. She removed her travelling bonnet and pelisse, washed her face and hands in the basin, and examined her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked tired, pale, older than her 24 years. The strain of the day's revelations showed in the shadows under her eyes and the tight lines around her mouth. But she was still standing. That counted for something. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her hair, and went to meet her charge. The schoolroom was a bright, well-appointed space, clearly designed with a child's needs in mind. Maps hung on the walls, a globe sat in one corner, and bookshelves lined one entire side of the room. A large table dominated the center, scattered with papers and pencils and what appeared to be the remains of a dissected flower. Sitting at the table, bent over a book with fierce concentration, was a small figure in a black dress. Rosalind paused in the doorway. "Miss Patience?" The child looked up, and Rosalind found herself pinned by a gaze of startling intensity. Patience. Ashworth had her uncle's grey eyes, or perhaps his sister's, who would have been the child's mother, and she wielded them with all the force of a siege weapon. Her hair was dark and ruthlessly braided, her face pale and pointed, her expression hovering somewhere between suspicion and outright hostility. "You're the new governess," Patience said. It was not a question. "I'm Miss Blackwood. Your uncle has engaged me to... The last one cried when she left." Patience's voice was cool and clinical, like a scientist recording experimental results. "The one before her screamed. The one before that just stopped speaking entirely. Mrs. Crawford had to lead her out by the hand like a child. Which would you prefer?" Rosalind considered this for a moment. Then she moved into the room, pulled out a chair, and sat down across from her new pupil. "None of those, thank you," she said calmly. "Crying gives me headaches, screaming hurts my throat, and I've never been comfortable with extended silences. I thought perhaps I might try something different." Patience's eyes narrowed. "What?" "Staying." The word hung between them. Patience stared at her with evident skepticism, clearly waiting for the trick, the catch, the hidden condition that would prove this new governess was no different from the others. "You don't know me," the child said finally. "You don't know what I'm capable of." "That's true." Rosalind met her gaze steadily. "But you don't know me either, and I can be quite stubborn when I put my mind to it." A long silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, something that might almost have been a smile flickered at the corner of Patience's mouth. "The snakes are still in the garden shed," she said. "Just so you know." "Noted." Rosalind glanced at the dissected flower on the table. "What are you working on?" Patience's expression shifted, wariness giving way to something that looked almost like enthusiasm. I'm trying to understand how flowers make seeds. Mrs. Bradley. That was the one who cried, told me it wasn't a proper subject for young ladies. But Uncle Sebastian says that understanding how things work is never improper, so I've been conducting experiments. May I see? For the next hour, Rosalind sat with patience as the child explained her observations about plant reproduction, demonstrating a quick intelligence and genuine scientific curiosity that had clearly been stifled by previous governesses. The hostility gradually faded, replaced by the simple pleasure of having someone actually listen. It was manipulation, Rosalind knew. Patience was testing her with this sudden charm, just as surely as she had tested the others with her cruelty. But it was also real. The child's mind was genuinely hungry, and she had been starved of intellectual companionship. "Dinner is at 7 in the nursery," Patience said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Will you be eating with me?" "I believe so, yes. The others always ask to eat separately." Patience's eyes were very bright suddenly. "They said I was too difficult to manage at meals." Rosalind thought of all the meals she had eaten alone in her cramped lodgings, all the tables where she had sat in silence as her employer's children chattered around her, part of the furniture rather than the family. She understood loneliness. She understood being difficult because the alternative was being invisible. "I prefer company," she said. "Even difficult company." Patience stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and returned to her book. It was not acceptance. It was not trust. But it was a beginning. The days that followed settled into a tentative rhythm. Rosalind rose early, took her breakfast with Patience in the nursery, and spent the mornings on lessons reading, writing, arithmetic, and the natural sciences that so captured the child's imagination. Afternoons were devoted to drawing and music. Patience had talent for neither but gamely attempted both, or, when weather permitted, walks on the grounds. The Duke was rarely visible during these early days, closeted in his study with estate business or riding out to visit tenants. But Rosalind was aware of him, a presence felt rather than seen, his authority permeating every corner of the great house. Servants spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness. Patience mentioned him occasionally with a studied indifference that suggested deeper feelings carefully suppressed. It was on the 5th day that Rosalind first witnessed the Duke with his niece. She had taken Patience to the library after luncheon, hunting for a book on botanical illustration that the child had requested. The library at Thornfield was vast, 2 stories of leather-bound volumes, accessible by a spiralling staircase and a catwalk that circled the upper level. Rosalind had climbed to the upper gallery in search of the natural history section, leaving Patience exploring below. She had just located the book she sought when voices drifted up from below. "You promised." Patience's voice tight with anger. "I said perhaps." The Duke, patient but firm. "Perhaps is not a promise. You said perhaps we could ride together this afternoon. I've been waiting all week. And I have spent all week dealing with a drainage dispute in the South Fields. Tenant farmers do not wait for ducal convenience, Patience. Nothing waits for ducal convenience except me." The child's voice cracked. "You promised you would be different from father. You promised you would have time." Silence. Rosalind held her breath, knowing she should announce her presence, unable to make herself move. "Your father loved you very much." The Duke's voice had changed, roughened somehow. "His absence was not a choice. He chose her. He chose dying with her instead of living with me. That isn't—" A breath, harsh and uneven. "Patience. Your father did not choose to die. His heart gave out. The doctors said—" "I know what the doctors said." Patience's voice was very small now. "I also know he stopped trying after she was gone. He just stopped." More silence. Then, unexpectedly, the sound of movement boots on marble, the rustle of fabric, and when the Duke spoke again, his voice was closer, gentler. "I cannot promise to be different from your father. We are made of the same cloth, he and I cannot change my nature. But I can promise to try. I can promise that I will not stop trying, that I will not leave you alone in this great cold house without warning or explanation. Can that be enough, for now?" A long pause. Then, in a voice so quiet Rosalind barely heard it, "For now." "Good." The Duke cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, the familiar coolness had returned. "I believe I have an hour before my next appointment. If you can have your pony saddled in 10 minutes, we might manage a short ride before tea." Patience's response was a wordless sound of joy, followed by footsteps racing toward the door. Rosalind waited until the library had been silent for a full minute before descending the stairs, the book clutched to her chest like a shield. She should not have heard that conversation. It was too private, too raw, too human. It made the Duke something other than the cold pragmatist who had offered her employment as one might settle an account. It made him a man who loved his niece and did not know how to show it, who grieved for his sister and brother-in-law and did not know how to say it, who had built walls so high that even a child's pain could barely scale them. It made him, in short, the kind of man she could not afford to think about. She delivered the book to Patience's room and did not mention what she had overheard. 2 weeks into her employment, Rosalind could not sleep. This was not unusual. Her mind had always been too active for easy rest, churning through problems and possibilities long after her body begged for release. Tonight it was the accounts that kept her awake. She had been reviewing Patience's educational progress, making notes for future lessons, and had somehow found herself calculating the Duke's apparent annual income based on fragments of overheard conversation about rents and harvests. It was none of her business. But old habits died hard, and survival had made her an excellent observer of wealth and its distribution. The library would have books that might settle her mind, something dull and improving sermons, perhaps, or agricultural treatises. She pulled a wrapper over her nightgown, took a candle, and made her way through the silent corridors. The library was not empty. A single lamp burned at a desk in the far corner, and behind it sat the Duke, bent over a stack of papers with the intensity of a man fighting a battle against overwhelming odds. He had discarded his coat and cravat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his dark hair dishevelled as if he had been running his hands through it. He looked younger like this, less armoured, human. Rosalind froze in the doorway, torn between retreat and the impropriety of being seen in her nightclothes by her employer. Too late. His head came up, those grey eyes finding her in the candle-lit gloom. "Miss Blackwood." "Your Grace, I apologize. I did not realize the library would be occupied. I will stay." The word came out rougher than he perhaps intended, and he moderated his tone. "That is, you are welcome to use the library. I do not own the night hours." She should leave. Every rule of propriety demanded it. But he looked so tired, and the fire was warm, and she was already compromised beyond repair anyway. "I could not sleep," she said, moving toward the shelves. "I thought reading might help." A common remedy. He returned his attention to his papers, but she could feel his awareness of her presence, a prickle at the back of her neck. "What do you seek?" "Something dull. Sermons, perhaps." A sound escaped him that might, in another man, have been a laugh. "Third shelf from the left, near the window. My grandfather's collection, guaranteed to produce unconsciousness within pages." Rosalind found the shelf and selected a volume at random. But instead of retreating to her room, she found herself lingering, drawn by curiosity and something else she did not care to name. "May I ask what keeps your Grace awake at such an hour?" He looked up again, and this time there was a flicker of something surprised, perhaps, that she would dare the question. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, the tension easing a fraction. A dispute with my steward over crop rotation. A letter from my solicitor regarding certain family matters. 3 invitations to social events I have no desire to attend and cannot reasonably refuse. The usual burdens of position. It sounds exhausting. It is. He set down his pen, rotating his neck as if to release accumulated strain. But there is no one else to carry it. My father died when I was 24. Edmund has never been capable of responsibility, and my sister— He stopped abruptly. "Your sister is dead," Rosalind said quietly, "and you have been carrying the weight alone ever since." His eyes met hers, and for a moment the armor cracked. She saw grief there, and loneliness, and a terrible exhausted determination. "You are very observant, Miss Blackwood. I was a governess for 6 years. Observation was a survival skill. And now?" His voice was soft. "What skills do you employ for survival now?" It was a dangerous question. The hour was late, the setting intimate, and she was standing in her nightclothes before a man who was both her employer and, she was coming to realize, entirely too interesting for her peace of mind. "The same ones," she said, "watching, learning, adapting, making myself useful so that I cannot easily be discarded." "You think I would discard you?" "I think everyone is discarded eventually." The words came out more bitter than she intended. When we cease to be useful, we cease to exist. It is the way of the world. He was silent for a long moment. Then he rose from his desk and moved toward her, stopping at a distance that was proper, but felt far too close. "My brother told you that you were useful," he said quietly. "Useful for his schemes, his manipulations, his selfish ends. He made you believe that utility was your only value." Rosalind's breath caught. "That isn't— It is exactly what happened. I have seen it before, not with Edmund, but with men like him. They find women who have been taught that service is survival, that their worth lies only in what they can provide for others. And they exploit that belief until there is nothing left." "You speak as if you know me." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We have barely exchanged a dozen sentences." "I know what I have observed." His grey eyes held hers, refusing to let her look away. "I know that you arrived at this house expecting to be thrown out, and when you were offered employment instead, your first instinct was to refuse anything that smelled of charity. I know that you have spent 2 weeks making yourself indispensable to my niece, not through manipulation, but through genuine care. I know that you sit up late at night calculating accounts that are not your concern, because understanding a household's finances is another form of self-protection." Rosalind's cheeks burned. "You have been watching me." "I watch everything that happens in my house. It is my responsibility." A pause. "And yes, I have been watching you." The confession hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was prepared to address. Rosalind clutched her book of sermons like a shield, acutely aware of the thin fabric of her wrapper, the loose fall of her hair, the dangerous intimacy of this midnight encounter. "I should go," she said. "You should." But he did not move, and neither did she. "Your Grace." "Sebastian." The name came out rough, almost unwilling. "When we are alone like this, in the small hours when the house sleeps, you may call me Sebastian, if you wish." It was an invitation she should refuse. Familiarity led to attachment, and attachment led to pain, and she had suffered enough pain to last several lifetimes. But he looked so tired, so alone. So like the man in the library with his niece, awkwardly trying to connect across walls he had spent years building. "Sebastian," she said softly, You should sleep. The disputes and letters will wait until morning." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something warmer. "Is that an order, Miss Blackwood?" "Rosalind." The name escaped before she could stop it. "Fair is fair." "Rosalind." He said it like he was tasting it, testing the shape of it on his tongue. "A good name. Strong." "It was my grandmother's." "Then I hope you will live up to it." He stepped back, finally, creating distance where there had been dangerous proximity. "Good night, Rosalind. I hope the sermons provide the tedium you seek." She fled then, clutching her book and her candle and the memory of her name in his mouth. But she did not read the sermons that night. She lay awake instead, staring at the ceiling of her modest room, and thought about grey eyes and tired shoulders, and the way a cold man could suddenly seem warm. She was in trouble. She knew it with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had survived by recognizing danger. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not sure she wanted to escape. On her way back to her room, something made Rosalind pause in the long gallery. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the portraits that lined the walls, generations of Ashworths, staring down with varying degrees of hauteur and dignity. She found herself drawn to one portrait in particular, hung slightly apart from the formal family groupings. A young man in riding clothes, probably early 20s, with dark hair and grey eyes, and the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked nothing like the Duke she had come to know. This man was open, vital, full of an energy that seemed barely contained by the canvas. But it was him. She recognized the line of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular way he held his head. Sebastian Ashworth, before whatever had happened to freeze him into his current form. "What happened to you?" she wondered. "What made you become the man you are now?" She thought of what Mrs. Crawford had said about the Ashworth men, how they felt everything deeply and expressed nothing at all. She thought of Sebastian's sister, dead 3 years now, and the brother-in-law who had followed her to the grave. She thought of Edmund, charming and destructive, leaving a trail of ruined women in his wake while his elder brother paid the debts and bore the responsibility. She thought of Charlotte Merriweather walking into a river because Edmund Ashworth had taken everything from her and left nothing worth living for. And she thought of herself, standing in this gallery in the small hours of the morning, looking at a portrait of a man who no longer existed, and wondering if some remnant of him might still survive beneath the ice. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of romantic fantasy that had led her into Edmund's trap in the first place. But as she turned away from the portrait and made her way back to her room, Rosalind could not shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. Some door had opened that might never close again. She fell asleep at last with the image of grey eyes burning behind her own, and dreamed of a young man with a ghost of a smile, reaching out across years of carefully constructed distance. 3 weeks had transformed the rhythm of Rosalind's days into something approaching normalcy, or as normal as life could be in a great house where she occupied the peculiar space between servant and guest, neither quite one nor the other. Patience had not driven her away. This fact seemed to astonish everyone in the household, from Mrs. Crawford, who had begun leaving small treats on Rosalind's breakfast tray, to the footman, who now greeted her with genuine smiles rather than the wary neutrality reserved for temporary staff. Even Patience herself seemed surprised, testing Rosalind's resolve with decreasing frequency as the days passed. The snakes remained in the garden shed, undisturbed. "You're still here," Patience observed one morning, looking up from her arithmetic with an expression of grudging respect. "Sarah, the one who cried, lasted 12 days. You've beaten her record." I wasn't aware we were keeping score. I always keep score. Patience returned to her sums, but there was something lighter in her manner now, something that looked almost like trust beginning to form. "Uncle Sebastian asked about you at breakfast yesterday. He wanted to know how your lessons were progressing." Rosalind's pen stuttered on the page she was marking. "Did he?" "He asks about you quite often, actually." Patience's voice was studiedly casual. "More than he asked about the others. Mrs. Crawford says it's because you're a distant cousin and he feels responsible for your welfare. But I don't think that's the real reason." "And what do you think the real reason is?" Patience looked up, grey eyes so like her uncle's, sharp with intelligence beyond her years. "I think he's lonely. And I think you might be lonely too. Lonely people recognize each other." The observation struck too close to the truth. Rosalind busied herself with the marking, unwilling to let an 8-year-old see how accurately she had hit the mark. "Your arithmetic is improving," she said, deliberately changing the subject. "You've only made 2 errors on this page." Patience accepted the deflection with the grace of a child who had learned when not to push. But her words lingered in Rosalind's mind long after the lesson ended, a stone dropped into still water that continued to send ripples outward. Lonely people recognize each other. She had been lonely for years, she realized. Even before Edmund, before the false marriage and the shattered illusions, she had been alone in a fundamental way that no amount of employment or occupation could address. Governesses lived in a kind of social purgatory, too educated for the servants' hall, too dependent for the drawing room. She had grown accustomed to isolation, had built her identity around it, had told herself that solitude was strength. But it wasn't strength. It was survival. And survival, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as living. The household's quiet rhythm shattered 3 days later, with the arrival of a letter bearing an unfamiliar seal. Rosalind was in the schoolroom when the summons came, a footman appearing at the door with word that His Grace requested her presence in his study immediately. The formality of the message set her nerves on edge. Their midnight encounter in the library had not been repeated, and their interactions since had been carefully proper, conducted in daylight with appropriate witnesses. She found Sebastian standing at his window, his back to the door, tension visible in every line of his shoulders. "You wished to see me, Your Grace?" He turned. The coolness she had come to expect was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. He held a letter in his hand, the paper crumpled slightly, as if he had been gripping it too hard. "Close the door, please." She did, her heart beginning to pound. "Has something happened?" "Edmund has written." The words came out flat, controlled. "Not to me, he would not dare. To his solicitor, who has forwarded the relevant portions. It seems my brother has been indiscreet. Indiscreet. He has been telling stories in Paris, about a governess who came to Thornfield Abbey claiming to be his wife, about a duke who took her in, employed her, kept her under his roof." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "The stories have reached London. They will reach the local gentry soon enough." The blood drained from Rosalind's face. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that speculate about why a man would shelter a woman so compromised. The kind that suggest your presence here is not merely charitable." He met her eyes. "I am sorry. I should have anticipated this. Edmund has always preferred to wound from a distance." Rosalind sank into a chair without asking permission, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She had been so careful, so proper, so determined to rebuild some semblance of respectability from the ruins Edmund had left. And now, with a few careless words in a Parisian salon, he had destroyed even that fragile hope. "What do I do?" she heard herself ask. "Where do I go?" "Nowhere." Sebastian's voice was firm. "You have done nothing wrong. I will not have you driven from this household by gossip and innuendo." "But your reputation—" "My reputation can withstand scandal. I am a duke. We are permitted our eccentricities. A ghost of humour flickered across his features, there and gone. The question is, how best to protect yours? I have no reputation left to protect. The words came out hollow. Edmund saw to that the moment I set foot in this house. You have a position here, a place, a child who depends on you. Sebastian moved closer, his voice softening. Patience has begun to heal under your care. I have watched it happening, the anger fading, the trust growing. I will not allow my brother to take that from her, or from you. Rosalind looked up at him, this cold, careful man who kept offering her lifelines when she expected to drown. Why? She asked. Why do you continue to help me? The obligation you felt you discharged it weeks ago. Every day I remain here puts you at greater risk. Yet you keep... She stopped, unable to find the words for what he kept doing. Protecting her, watching over her, making her feel, for the first time in years, that she mattered as more than a useful pair of hands. Because it is right. His voice was quiet but certain. Because Edmund has taken enough. Because... He stopped, something shifting in his expression. For a moment, she thought he might say more, might finally name the thing that had been growing between them in midnight libraries and accidental glances. But the shutters came down, the armour returning, and when he spoke again his voice was brisk with purpose. I have sent word to my solicitor. We will address this matter legally if necessary. Edmund's slander can be prosecuted if he continues. In the meantime, I intend to invite several families to the Abbey for a house party next month. Your presence at such an event, in your proper role as Patience's governess, will do much to quiet the rumours. A house party? Rosalind stared at him. You hate social gatherings. I do. Something that might have been a smile tugged at his mouth. But I am capable of enduring temporary discomfort for a worthy cause. And there is a secondary benefit. Patience will be required to interact with children her own age. It will be good for her development. It was practical, logical, entirely characteristic of the man she was coming to know. But Rosalind heard what he did not say, that he was willing to open his home to strangers, to endure weeks of social obligation, to put himself through what was clearly a kind of personal torture, all to protect a woman who had no claim on his consideration beyond an accident of his brother's cruelty. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do not thank me yet." His expression darkened. A house party means eligible young ladies and their matchmaking mothers. I will be hunted like game across my own estate. If you have any gratitude, you might consider serving as a distraction. A distraction? If I am seen paying attention to the governess, even in the most innocent way, it may discourage the more aggressive pursuit. His eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. Unless you object to being used as a shield. She should object. The arrangement he proposed would only fuel the rumours they were trying to quiet. But the alternative, watching him be pursued by simpering debutantes while she stood in the shadows, was somehow worse. "I am at your Grace's service," she said, and if her voice emerged slightly breathless, she chose not to examine why. The preparations for the house party consumed the following weeks. Mrs. Crawford bustled through the house like a general marshalling forces, organizing cleaning crews and menu planning and the 1,000 details that went into hosting members of the gentry. Rosalind found herself drawn into the preparations despite her nominal role as governess, her practical nature making her useful for the kind of organizational work that left Sebastian glazed with boredom. "You have a talent for this," he observed one evening, reviewing her neatly organized lists of room assignments and dietary requirements. They had fallen into the habit of meeting in his study after Patience was abed, ostensibly to discuss the child's progress, but increasingly to simply talk. "The army could use you. I spent 6 years managing nurseries full of children who did not wish to be managed. A house party is merely a different scale of chaos. a significantly larger scale. He set down the papers, leaning back in his chair with a weariness that had become familiar to her. 23 guests, not counting their personal servants. My household will double in size overnight. You could cancel, say you've taken ill, and give Edmund the satisfaction of knowing his rumours have achieved their purpose. Sebastian shook his head. No. We face this head-on and emerge victorious. It is the only way. You speak of it like a military campaign. Social events are merely warfare conducted with tea and pleasantries. The casualties are reputations rather than lives, but the stakes can feel equally high. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. You will need appropriate clothing. The things you have are suitable for the schoolroom, but if you are to appear at any of the entertainments, I cannot afford new clothing. I can. He held up a hand to forestall her protest. Consider it a necessary expense. If you are to serve as my distraction, you must be sufficiently distracting. The compliment, if it was a compliment, sent heat flooding to her cheeks. Your Grace. Sebastian. His voice softened. We agreed, did we not? When we are alone. Sebastian. The name still felt dangerous on her tongue, intimate in ways she knew she should resist. I cannot accept gifts from you. It would only confirm the rumours. The dressmaker will be paid from the household accounts. You are an employee. Employees require appropriate uniforms. No one will question it. It was a transparent rationalization, and they both knew it. But Rosalind was tired of fighting, tired of refusing every kindness because acceptance might suggest impropriety. She had been proper her entire life, and what had it gained her? A false marriage and shattered hopes, and a reputation in ruins regardless of her behaviour. Very well, she said quietly, but nothing extravagant. I will not be made into someone I am not. I would not dream of it. His eyes held hers, warm with something that might have been admiration. Your practicality is one of your finest qualities. I would not see it compromised for the sake of fashion. Later, lying sleepless in her narrow bed, Rosalind turned his words over in her mind. One of your finest qualities. The implication that he had catalogued her qualities, had considered them, had formed opinions about which were finest. It should not have pleased her so much. It should not have made her heart race like a girl in the first flush of romantic feeling. But it did. God help her, it did. The house party guests began arriving on a grey November morning, their carriages processing up the long drive like ships sailing into harbour. Rosalind watched from the schoolroom window, Patience pressed against the glass beside her. That's Lady Ashton's carriage, Patience said, her voice flat with disapproval. She has 3 daughters who all think they should be the next Duchess. Uncle Sebastian hides in his study when she visits. How do you know which carriage is hers? I make it my business to know things. Patience glanced up at her, grey eyes sharp. Lady Ashton's daughters are named Honoria, Cecilia, and Marguerite. Honoria is the eldest and the prettiest. She'll be the most aggressive. Cecilia plays the pianoforte badly and will insist on performing. Marguerite is the youngest and the cleverest, which means she's the most dangerous. You've given this considerable thought. Uncle Sebastian is mine. The fierce protectiveness in the child's voice was unmistakable. I don't want any of those women taking him away. Rosalind knelt to meet her eyes. No one is going to take your uncle away. A wife would not replace you in his affections. Mother's death replaced me in father's. The words emerged quiet and matter-of-fact, more devastating for their lack of emotion. He loved her more than me. When she was gone, I wasn't enough to keep him here. Oh, sweetheart. Rosalind gathered the child into her arms, feeling the small body stiffen, and then, gradually, relax against her. Your father's death was not about you. His heart was broken, literally broken, and no amount of love could have mended it. But your uncle is made of stronger stuff. He will not leave you. How do you know? Because I've seen how he looks at you. Rosalind pulled back to meet Patience's tear-bright eyes. And because I've seen the portrait of him as a young man. He was warm once, open once. That person is still in there somewhere. You help him remember that. Do you? Patience asked quietly. Help him remember, I mean. The question hung between them, too perceptive for a child of 8, too dangerous to answer honestly. Rosalind chose retreat. Come, she said, rising. We should prepare for dinner. You'll want to look your best when you meet the Ashton girls. Why? So they know they have competition? Despite everything, Rosalind laughed. Something like that. Dinner that first evening was an exercise in controlled chaos. 23 guests filled the dining room, their conversation a rising tide of gossip, politics, and social maneuvering. Rosalind sat far below the salt, in the position appropriate to a governess, but she found she had an excellent view of the proceedings. Sebastian presided at the head of the table with the air of a man enduring a necessary but unpleasant duty. He was courteous to his guests, attentive to their needs, impeccable in his role as host, and visibly counting the moments until he could escape. Rosalind watched him deflect Lady Ashton's maternal machinations with practiced ease, turning aside pointed questions about his matrimonial intentions with responses so blandly uninformative that they verged on art. But she also watched the Ashton daughters. Patience had been right about Honoria. She was beautiful in a cold, classical way, and she pursued Sebastian with the single-minded determination of a huntress. Every time he turned away, she found a reason to draw his attention back. Every time he spoke to another lady, she contrived to interrupt with some witty observation. And Marguerite, the clever one, watched it all with calculating eyes, clearly gathering information for use in some future campaign. You're staring. Rosalind startled. The woman beside her, a Mrs. Pemberton, wife of a local baronet, was watching her with an expression that fell somewhere between amusement and knowing speculation. I beg your pardon? At his grace. You've been staring at him throughout the fish course. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was low, pitched for privacy. I don't blame you, he's worth looking at, but you might be more discreet. The Ashton woman has already noticed. Rosalind felt her cheeks flame. I was merely... You were watching him the way a woman watches a man she wants but cannot have. Mrs. Pemberton's tone softened. I know that look. I wore it myself once, before I learned to settle for what was possible. I have settled for what is possible. Rosalind's voice came out sharper than she intended. I am a governess. My position is clear. Is it? Mrs. Pemberton raised an eyebrow. Then why did the Duke insist you be seated in the dining room rather than the servants' hall? Why did he ensure your gown came from the same dressmaker who serves his sister's memory? Why does he keep glancing at you when he thinks no one is watching? Rosalind followed Mrs. Pemberton's gaze to the head of the table. Sebastian was engaged in conversation with the elderly Lady Thornwood, but even as she watched, his eyes flicked toward her a quick, almost involuntary glance before returning to his companion. I don't know what you imagine. I imagine nothing. Mrs. Pemberton returned her attention to her plate. I merely observe, and I have observed that whatever is between you and the Duke, it is neither simple nor settled. Be careful, Miss Blackwood. House parties can be dangerous for women in uncertain positions. The warning stayed with Rosalind through the rest of the meal and into the drawing-room, where the ladies withdrew while the gentlemen lingered over port. She positioned herself in a corner, hoping to avoid notice, but Honoria Ashton found her within minutes. Miss Blackwood, is it? Honoria's smile did not reach her eyes. The governess. How delightful that His Grace allows you to join the company. Very modern of him. He is a modern man in many ways. Is he? Honoria's gaze sharpened. You must know him quite well, having lived in his household these past weeks. Tell me, is the ice as thick as it appears? Or might the right woman find a way to thaw it? It was a trap, of course. Any answer Rosalind gave would be used against her evidence of presumption if she claimed knowledge, evidence of insignificance if she denied it. I am merely an employee, she said carefully. I teach his niece and take my meals in the nursery. I am hardly qualified to speak to his Grace's temperament. How modest. Honoria's smile turned brittle. And yet I've heard the most fascinating rumours about how you came to be employed here. Something about a misunderstanding with the Duke's brother? The room suddenly felt very quiet, though conversations continued around them. Rosalind felt, rather than saw, the attention shifting toward them, guests registering the tension between the governess and the nobleman's daughter. I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. No? Honoria's voice rose slightly, carrying to nearby listeners. The story I heard was that you arrived at Thornfield claiming to be Edmund Ashworth's wife, that the marriage was annulled under irregular circumstances, that His Grace took pity on you and offered employment rather than turn you out to face the consequences of your, a delicate pause, error in judgment. The blood drained from Rosalind's face. She had known the rumours would follow her, but to have them spoken aloud, in company, with such calculated cruelty, that is quite enough. The voice came from behind Honoria, cold as winter and sharp as a blade. Rosalind looked up to find Sebastian standing in the drawing-room doorway, his expression thunderous. Miss Blackwood is a member of my household and under my protection. His voice carried through the suddenly silent room. I will not tolerate her being subjected to gossip and innuendo in my own home. Is that understood? Honoria had gone pale, her social instincts finally catching up with her spite. Your Grace, I meant no offence. Then you will apologize. It was not a request. Now. A terrible silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on them, the furious Duke, the mortified debutante, the governess caught between them. Rosalind wanted to sink through the floor, to disappear, to be anywhere but here in the centre of this humiliating tableau. I apologize, Honoria whispered, the words clearly costing her. I should not have repeated unfounded rumours. No, you should not have. Sebastian's gaze swept the room, taking in the avid faces, the barely concealed excitement at the drama unfolding before them. Let me be clear, since there seems to be some confusion. Miss Blackwood came to this house as the victim of my brother's scheming. She was deceived, defrauded, and abandoned. I offered her employment because it was the right thing to do, and because she has proven herself invaluable in caring for my niece. Anyone who wishes to make more of the situation than that may leave my household immediately. Is that understood? Murmurs of assent rippled through the room. Honoria retreated to her mother's side, her face burning with humiliation. Sebastian crossed to where Rosalind stood frozen in her corner, and for a moment she thought he might take her hand, might make some gesture that would confirm every rumour rather than dispel them. Instead, he simply looked at her, his grey eyes warm with something she was afraid to name. Miss Blackwood, perhaps you might check on Patience. I believe she was having difficulty sleeping. It was an escape, graciously offered, and Rosalind seized it with profound gratitude. She murmured something appropriate and fled the drawing-room, feeling the weight of 24 stares boring into her back. She did not check on Patience. She went instead to her room, closed the door, and sat in the darkness, shaking. He had defended her, publicly, dramatically, in a way that would set tongues wagging from here to London. He had risked his reputation, his standing, his carefully maintained distance from scandal, all to protect her from a vicious girl's malice. Why? The question tortured her through the long hours of the night. She knew why she wanted it to be. She knew the dangerous, impossible hope that had taken root in her heart, despite every effort to suppress it. But hope was treacherous, and Rosalind had learned long ago not to trust it. Men did not sacrifice their standing for governesses. Dukes did not challenge their guests for servants. Whatever Sebastian's motives, they could not be what she secretly wished them to be. And yet, why does he keep glancing at you when he thinks no one is watching? Mrs. Pemberton's words echoed in her mind, refusing to be silenced. The house party continued despite the tension of that first evening, though Rosalind noticed that the Ashton daughters had become considerably more subdued. She kept to the schoolroom as much as possible, emerging only when duty required meals where her absence would be noted, activities involving patience, the occasional evening gathering where Sebastian had specifically requested her presence. Those evenings were sweet torture. She would sit in her corner, trying to focus on her needlework, while Sebastian moved through the room dispensing courtesy and deflecting pursuit. And every so often enough that she could not dismiss it as coincidence, his eyes would find hers across the crowded room, and something would pass between them that made her breath catch. It was on the fifth night that everything changed. The party had gathered in the music room for an evening of amateur performance. Cecilia Ashton had just finished murdering a Mozart sonata, to polite applause that did nothing to disguise the collective relief at her conclusion. Other guests took their turns at the pianoforte, some competent, some merely enthusiastic, until the evening's entertainment wound down to comfortable conversation and cards. Rosalind had retreated to her usual corner when Sebastian appeared at her elbow. "Walk with me." It was not a request, and it was not appropriate, and she should have refused. But the room was stuffy, and her heart was racing, and when he looked at her like that, she found she could refuse him nothing. They slipped out through the French doors onto the terrace, into the crisp November night. The sky was clear, scattered with stars, and their breath made clouds in the cold air. "You've been avoiding me." His voice was quiet, pitched for her ears alone. "I've been maintaining appropriate distance." "There is no appropriate distance anymore." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Not after what happened in the drawing room. The entire county believes I am in love with you." The words hit her like a blow. "And are you?" She had not meant to ask. The question emerged of its own accord, pulled from some desperate place she had tried so hard to keep locked away. Sebastian was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm against her cold ones. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know what I feel. I have spent 8 years refusing to feel anything at all. And then you arrived with your practicality and your courage and your refusal to be broken, and I—" He stopped, his grip tightening. "You make me want things I had convinced myself I did not need." "What things?" "Connection. Warmth. Someone to share the burden rather than carrying it alone." His eyes met hers, raw and open in a way she had never seen from him. "I watch you with patience, the way you love her without condition or reservation, and I think that is what it should look like. That is what I have forgotten how to do." "Sebastian." "I know." His voice was rough. "I know it is impossible. I know the difference in our stations, the scandal it would cause, the damage to your reputation which is already compromised beyond repair by my brother's malice. I know all the reasons why I should maintain distance, why I should let you go when the house party ends, why I should find some sensible match and be satisfied with duty rather than—" He broke off. In the moonlight, she could see the struggle on his face, the man he had forced himself to become, warring with the man he had once been. "Rather than what?" she whispered. "Rather than this." He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, not a tentative exploration of new territory. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving for 8 years and had finally found sustenance, desperate and hungry and utterly consuming. His hands came up to cup her face, tilting her head to deepen the contact, and she melted into him without thought or resistance. She had been kissed before hasty, stolen moments with Edmund that had felt more like performance than passion. But this was something else entirely. This was fire and need and the kind of connection she had stopped believing was possible. She clutched at his coat, pulling him closer, drowning in sensation. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Sebastian's forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed, his expression almost pained. "I should not have done that." "No." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of stubble beneath her fingers. "But I'm glad you did." He laughed a real laugh, startled and warm, and caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "You are a remarkable woman, Rosalind Blackwood. You make me forget all the reasons I should be careful." "Perhaps you've been careful long enough." "Perhaps." He pulled back, though he did not release her hand. "But caution is what has kept this estate solvent and my reputation intact. I cannot simply abandon it because a beautiful woman has turned my head." "Is that what I've done? Turned your head?" "You have done considerably more than that." His eyes held hers, serious now. "You have made me want a future I never thought I would have. A future with warmth and laughter and children and—" He stopped abruptly. And I am getting ahead of myself." He released her hand, stepping back to create distance between them. "The house party has another week to run. When it ends, when the guests have departed and we are no longer under observation, we should talk properly. There are things I need to say, things I need to offer, and I want to do it right." Rosalind's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Things you need to offer?" "Rosalind." He said her name like a vow. "You must know by now that I do not do anything by halves. If we pursue this, it will not be some clandestine arrangement. It will be—" He paused, choosing his words. "It will be everything or nothing. I need you to understand that before we go any further. Everything or nothing." The words echoed in her mind, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I understand." "Good." He offered his arm, formal and proper, as if he had not just kissed her senseless in the moonlight. "Then we should return before our absence is noted. The gossips will have quite enough to discuss without adding fuel to their fire." They re-entered the music room separately, Rosalind first, Sebastian following a few minutes later through a different door. But as she crossed to her corner, she caught Mrs. Pemberton watching her with knowing eyes, and she knew their caution had not been enough. The older woman simply smiled and returned to her conversation, offering no comment. But the message was clear. She had seen, and she knew, and the secret was no longer theirs alone. The final days of the house party passed in a haze of anticipation and anxiety. Rosalind went through the motions of her duties lessons with patience, appearances at meals, polite conversation with guests who seemed increasingly convinced that she was destined to become their hostess. Sebastian maintained appropriate distance in public, but his eyes found hers constantly, speaking a language of promise and patience that made her skin warm and her heart race. And then Edmund arrived. He came without invitation, without warning, sweeping into the entrance hall on the morning of the party's final day, with all the careless charm that had once deceived her so completely. "Brother!" His voice carried through the house, drawing servants and guests alike. "I've come to pay my respects. I hear you've been hosting quite the gathering." Rosalind was descending the main staircase with patience when she heard him. She froze, her hand tightening on the banister, her body suddenly cold despite the warmth of the house. "Miss Blackwood?" Patience looked up at her, worried. "You've gone very pale." "I'm fine." The lie came automatically, even as her mind raced. Edmund was here. Edmund, who had ruined her, abandoned her, spread rumours that had followed her across the country. Edmund, who had stood in a church and promised her forever, knowing it was all a lie. She wanted to flee to her room, to hide until he was gone. But Patience was with her, and Patience needed protection from this man who was, technically, her uncle. "Let's find your Uncle Sebastian," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I believe he's in his study." But it was too late. Edmund had already spotted them on the stairs, and his smile widened with malicious delight. "Well, well, if it isn't my blushing bride." He started toward them, ignoring the shocked murmurs of the guests who had gathered to witness the commotion. "How delightful to see you again, my dear. I hear you've made yourself quite comfortable in my brother's household." "Mr. Ashworth." Rosalind kept her voice cool, placing herself between Edmund and Patience. "I was not aware you planned to return to England." "Plans change." His eyes raked over her, assessing. "You're looking well. Being a governess must agree with you. Or is it something else that's put such colour in your cheeks?" "That is enough." Sebastian's voice cut through the hall like a blade, and Rosalind nearly collapsed with relief as he emerged from his study. His face was thunderous, his body rigid with controlled fury. "You are not welcome here, Edmund. Leave." "Is that any way to greet your only brother?" Edmund's smile never wavered. "I've merely come to collect what belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you." "No?" Edmund's gaze settled on Rosalind with predatory intensity. "Not even the woman I married? The ceremony may have been irregular, but one could argue in certain courts that the intent was binding." "The ceremony was fraudulent." "You know that better than anyone." "I know what my solicitor tells me." Edmund reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "And he tells me that certain marriages, even those performed by defrocked clergymen, may be considered valid if both parties entered into them in good faith. Miss Blackwood certainly believed she was married, and I was quite sincere in my affections." The blood drained from Rosalind's face. "That's not possible." "Isn't it?" Edmund's smile turned cruel. "The law is a flexible thing, my dear. Given the right arguments, the right pressure, who knows what a judge might decide? Perhaps Sebastian has failed to mention that I've been in correspondence with several barristers on the subject." Rosalind looked to Sebastian, desperate for reassurance. But his expression had gone carefully blank, the mask he wore when facing circumstances beyond his control. "Whatever game you're playing," Sebastian began. "No game." Edmund cut him off. "A business proposition. You have something I want: money, position, the respectability I've been denied. I have something you want: the guarantee that I will never trouble Miss Blackwood again. Surely we can come to some arrangement." "You're blackmailing me." "I prefer to think of it as negotiating." Edmund's eyes flickered to Rosalind. "Unless, of course, Miss Blackwood would prefer to return with me voluntarily. We could make a fresh start, she and I. Paris is lovely this time of year." "I would sooner die." The words came out fierce and certain, surprising even herself. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a flash of genuine anger beneath the charm. "Careful, my dear. You may yet have the opportunity." "That is enough." Sebastian moved forward, placing himself between Edmund and the staircase. "You will leave this house immediately. If you attempt to contact Miss Blackwood again, if you pursue this absurd claim of marriage, I will destroy you. Not financially, not socially, personally. Do you understand?" The brothers faced each other across the entrance hall, and for a moment the resemblance between them was striking: the same dark hair, the same sharp features, the same intensity of purpose. But where Sebastian's strength had been forged through responsibility and sacrifice, Edmund's had curdled into something corrupt. You always did protect the strays. Edmund's voice was quiet now, dangerous. Mother, father, our sainted sister, and now the governess who warmed your bed while pretending to teach your niece. Sebastian hit him. It happened so quickly that Rosalind barely registered the movement. One moment the brothers were facing each other. The next Edmund was sprawled on the marble floor, blood streaming from his nose. "Get out!" Sebastian's voice was utterly flat. "If I see you again, I will not stop at one blow." Edmund struggled to his feet, his charm finally cracked, rage twisting his features into something ugly. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "Both of you. I'll see you both destroyed." He was gone within minutes, his hired carriage disappearing down the drive as quickly as it had arrived. But the damage was done. The remaining house party guests had witnessed everything: the accusations, the violence, the barely concealed passion between the Duke and his governess. Rosalind stood frozen on the stairs, Patience pressed against her side, and felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The guests departed that afternoon, fleeing the wreckage of the house party like rats from a sinking ship. Within hours, Thornfield Abbey had emptied of everyone except the family and servants, and silence settled over the great house like a shroud. Rosalind retreated to her room and stayed there, unable to face Sebastian, unable to process what had happened. Edmund's threats echoed in her mind, mixing with the memory of Sebastian's fist, connecting with his brother's face, the raw violence that had lurked beneath his controlled surface. He had defended her again, publicly, violently, irrevocably, and in doing so, he had confirmed every rumor, validated every suspicion, announced to the world that the governess was more to him than an employee. She should leave. The thought circled endlessly through her mind. She should pack her meager belongings and disappear before the scandal destroyed them both. Sebastian might recover dukes were allowed their indiscretions, but she never would. Edmund's threats about the validity of their marriage added a new dimension of fear. What if he was right? What if some court somewhere decided that she was his wife after all? A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Miss Blackwood?" It was Patience's voice, small and uncertain. "May I come in?" Rosalind opened the door to find the child standing in the corridor, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Are you leaving?" Patience's lower lip trembled. "Everyone says you're going to leave, that you have to leave because of what happened." Rosalind gathered her into her arms, feeling the child's small body shake with suppressed sobs. "Who is everyone?" "The servants. I heard them talking." Patience pulled back to meet her eyes. "Please don't go. You're the only one who stayed, the only one who didn't run away." "Oh, Patience." Rosalind brushed the hair from the child's face. "I don't want to leave you. But sometimes adults have to make difficult choices." "No." The word came out fierce, determined. "I won't let you. Uncle Sebastian won't let you. He loves you, anyone can see that, and you love him, and you love me, and we're supposed to be a family." A family. The word struck Rosalind like a physical blow. It was everything she had wanted, everything she had stopped believing she could have. A home, a purpose, people who would not abandon her when she ceased to be useful. It's not that simple. Why not? Patience's grey eyes, so like her uncle's, burned with righteous indignation. Why can't things be simple? Why does everyone always make things complicated when they don't have to be? Rosalind opened her mouth to explain, to offer some adult rationale about reputation and scandal and the consequences of poor choices. But the words wouldn't come, because Patience was right, or rather, she was asking the right question. Why did things have to be complicated? What exactly was she protecting by leaving, other than a reputation already in ruins? Stay here, she said quietly. I need to speak with your uncle. She found Sebastian in the library, standing before the fire with a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He turned when she entered, and the raw emotion on his face nearly undid her. I've drafted a letter of reference, he said, before she could speak. For when you seek a new position, it speaks to your character and capabilities without... I don't want a letter of reference. Rosalind. His voice was gentle, defeated. You cannot stay. Not after today. The scandal... What scandal? She moved closer, driven by some force she could not name. Your brother is a fraud and a blackmailer. Everyone who witnessed today's events knows it. If anything, your defense of me will be seen as honorable a gentleman protecting a woman under his care from a villain's persecution. That's a generous interpretation. It's the truth. She stopped before him, close enough to touch. You struck your brother because he threatened me, because he insulted me, because you could not bear to hear him speak of me that way. Yes. The admission came out rough. I could not bear it. Why? He was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then he set down his brandy glass and turned to face her fully. Because I love you. The words fell into the silence between them, simple and devastating. I love you, he repeated, his voice steadying. I love your strength and your practicality and your refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed lesser women. I love watching you with patience, seeing you bring warmth back into this cold house. I love arguing with you over accounts, reading with you in the library, stealing moments together when the world is not watching. He reached out to take her hands. I love you, and I want to marry you, and I do not care what scandal it causes, or what society thinks, or what my brother threatens, if you will have me. Rosalind stared at him, tears streaming down her face. I'm a governess, she whispered, a woman of no family, no fortune, no connections. Your peers will never accept me. My peers can go hang. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. I have endured their acceptance for 8 years and found it wholly unsatisfying. I find I am willing to trade it for something better. Your reputation was built on duty and coldness and the systematic denial of everything that makes life worth living. I am tired of it, Rosalind. I am tired of being the man everyone expects me to be. I want to be the man I used to be, the one in that portrait in the gallery, the one who believed in happiness. He lifted her hands to his lips. You make me remember how. She was crying in earnest now, tears of relief and joy and the release of years of suppressed longing. Edmund will fight this. He'll make claims about the marriage. My solicitors have already investigated. His arguments have no legal standing. The ceremony was fraudulent from beginning to end. You were never his wife. Sebastian's voice softened. You could be mine, though, if you choose it. She thought of everything she had lost, her savings, her position, her naive belief in happy endings. She thought of everything she had found, a child who needed her, a man who loved her, a home that had begun to feel like her own. She thought of Patience, waiting upstairs, desperate to know if she would stay. Yes, she said. Yes, I choose it. I choose you. Sebastian kissed her then, there in the library where they had first begun to know each other, and the fire crackled, and the night pressed against the windows, and Rosalind finally understood what it meant to be home. Later that night, long after Sebastian had escorted her back to her room with promises of tomorrow and forever, Rosalind sat at her small desk and composed a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular, a record, perhaps, for her own future reference. And it began, I came to this house expecting nothing. I had been deceived, abandoned, stripped of everything I thought I wanted. I believed my life was over. I was wrong. Life, I have learned, has a way of beginning again when we least expect it. In the ruins of one hope, another takes root. In the ashes of one love, false and hollow, a true love emerges. Tomorrow, the Duke of Thornfield will announce his intention to marry his niece's governess. Society will be scandalized, rumours will spread, Edmund Ashworth will rage and threaten, and eventually, I suspect, slink away to whatever fate awaits men who destroy everything they touch. But I will be here, in this house that has become my home, with a man who has become my heart, and a child who has become my daughter in all the ways that matter. I am no longer Miss Blackwood, governess and victim. I am Rosalind, beloved, and I am finally home. She folded the letter, tucked it away in her desk, and went to sleep. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Edmund's response, society's judgment, the countless details of wedding planning and scandal management. But tonight, she would rest in the certainty of being loved. It was, she thought as sleep claimed her, the most extraordinary sensation she had ever known. The morning after Sebastian's proposal dawned grey and cold, frost painting delicate patterns across the windows of Thornfield Abbey. Rosalind woke to the sound of birdsong and lay still for a long moment, testing the events of the previous day against the harsh light of reality. It had happened. All of it. Edmund's arrival and threats, Sebastian's violent defence, the guests fleeing like startled birds, and then the library, the firelight, the words that had changed everything. I love you, and I want to marry you. She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the warmth of her own skin, the rapid pulse at her wrists. It was real. Against all probability, against everything she had been taught to expect from life, it was real. A knock at her door brought her upright. "Come in." Patience burst through before the words had fully left her mouth, launching herself onto the bed with the unceremonious enthusiasm of childhood. "Is it true? Mrs. Crawford says you're going to marry Uncle Sebastian. She says we're to have a wedding before Christmas. She says I can be a flower girl if I promise not to put beetles in the pews." Beetles in the pews? I did it at Lady Thornwood's daughter's wedding. It was tremendously effective. Patience's grey eyes sparkled with mischief, but beneath the humour lay something fragile, hopeful. "Is it true, though? You're really going to stay?" Rosalind gathered the child into her arms, holding her close. "It's true. Your uncle asked me to marry him last night, and I said yes." Patience was quiet for a moment. Her face pressed against Rosalind's shoulder. When she spoke again, her voice was small. "Does that mean you'll be my aunt?" "I suppose it does." "And you won't leave? Even when I'm difficult? Even when I put snakes in places they shouldn't be?" Rosalind pulled back to meet her eyes. "Patience Ashworth, I have survived your snakes, your beetles, your silent treatment, and your attempts to make me cry. Do you really think marriage will make me any less stubborn?" A smile broke across Patience's face, a real smile, unguarded and joyful. "I think," she said slowly, "that Uncle Sebastian is very lucky." "I think we all are." They stayed that way for a while, wrapped in the warmth of the moment, until Mrs. Crawford appeared at the door with breakfast and the announcement that His Grace requested Miss Blackwood's presence in the morning room at her earliest convenience. Sebastian was standing at the window when she entered, silhouetted against the grey morning light. He turned at her approach, and the expression on his face made her breath catch tenderness and uncertainty, and something that looked almost like fear. "I was worried you might have reconsidered." "In the night?" Rosalind crossed to him, taking his hands. "I slept better than I have in years. Whatever doubts might have troubled me, they did not survive the morning." Relief softened his features. "I have been awake since dawn, composing and discarding letters. Announcements must be made, arrangements begun. I find myself uncharacteristically uncertain of how to proceed. That is because you are attempting to manage a wedding as you would manage an estate. She smiled up at him, with lists and schedules and optimal efficiency. But weddings are not drainage disputes, Sebastian. They are celebrations. I have little experience with celebrations. Then we shall learn together. He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to each palm. I have already written to my solicitor regarding Edmund's threats. The marriage claim has no legal foundation. He was bluffing, as I suspected. But I want the matter settled formally, documented beyond any possibility of future challenge. And Edmund himself? Sebastian's expression hardened. I have offered him a choice, a modest allowance and passage to America, with the understanding that he is never to return to England or contact you again, or I pursue criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and attempted extortion. My solicitors have compiled quite a substantial case. Will he accept the offer? Edmund is many things, but he is not stupid. He knows when he is beaten. Sebastian's jaw tightened. He sailed from Dover this morning. I received word an hour ago. The weight Rosalind had been carrying since Edmund's appearance, the fear that had coiled in her chest like a serpent, finally began to ease. He's gone. He's gone, and he will not trouble us again. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. I thought, when he appeared yesterday, that everything was ruined, that the life we were building would be torn apart before it could truly begin. I would not have allowed that. His arms came around her, holding her close. Whatever Edmund threatened, whatever he attempted, I would have protected you, protected us. By striking your own brother? By any means necessary. His voice was quiet but certain. You are mine now, Rosalind. Mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine to defend against anyone who would harm you. I do not take that responsibility lightly. She pulled back to look at him, this man who had spent 8 years building walls against emotion, who had convinced himself that love was weakness and vulnerability was risk. And yet here he was, laying himself open to her, offering everything he had kept so carefully guarded. I love you, she said. I don't think I've actually said the words yet. I should have last night, but I was so overwhelmed. He silenced her with a kiss, tender and thorough. You said yes, he murmured against her lips. That was eloquence enough. The announcement of the Duke of Thornfield's engagement to his niece's governess sent shockwaves through polite society. Letters arrived at Thornfield Abbey in floods, some congratulatory, some curious, more than a few scandalized. Lady Ashton was said to have taken to her bed for 3 days upon receiving the news, and her daughter Honoria had reportedly thrown a vase at a footman. I confess I find that rather satisfying, Sebastian remarked, reading the latest batch of correspondence with something approaching amusement. Honoria Ashton has been pursuing me since her debut season. The thought of her losing out to a governess must be particularly galling. You should not take pleasure in others' disappointment. Should I not? He looked up at her, one eyebrow raised. This from the woman who smiled quite distinctly when Mrs. Crawford reported that Lady Thornwood had called you that scheming fortune hunter at her Wednesday card party. Rosalind felt her cheeks warm. Lady Thornwood once told patients that orphans should be grateful for any attention they received, even if it came in the form of criticism. I may have harbored some uncharitable feelings toward her since. Then we are both flawed individuals. Sebastian set aside the letters and crossed to where she sat, pulling her to her feet. Well suited in our petty satisfactions. The wedding was set for 3 weeks hence, soon enough to quiet the worst of the gossip, late enough to allow for proper preparations. Rosalind had initially suggested a small, quiet ceremony, mindful of her lack of family and the scandal that surrounded their engagement. But Sebastian had overruled her. "You will be a duchess," he said firmly. "My wife. I will not have our marriage begin with apology or concealment. We will wed in the Abbey Chapel, with witnesses and celebration, and anyone who disapproves may stay home." And so the preparations began in earnest. The Abbey Chapel was cleaned and decorated, flowers ordered despite the season, a wedding breakfast planned that would feed half the county. Mrs. Crawford threw herself into the arrangements with military precision, managing everything from guest lists to menu planning with the efficiency of a general marshalling forces. Through it all, Rosalind found herself pulled in 100 different directions, dress fittings and etiquette lessons and consultations about household management. She was to be a duchess, and duchesses apparently required training. "It is ridiculous," she confessed to Patience one afternoon, collapsing into a chair in the schoolroom after 3 hours with a woman who had been hired to instruct her in proper forms of address. "I have managed households before. I have organized children and servants and difficult personalities. Why must I learn 17 different ways to address a viscountess?" "Because society is ridiculous." Patience looked up from her book with a wise expression far beyond her years. "That's what Mother always said. She hated it, all the rules and the customs and the endless pretending. She said the only genuine people she ever met were the servants and the children." "Your mother sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have loved her." Patience's voice softened. "And she would have loved you. She always said Uncle Sebastian needed someone to crack him open, someone brave enough to see past the ice." Rosalind reached out to brush a strand of hair from the child's face. "I am not particularly brave." "You stayed." Patience met her eyes. "When everyone else ran away, you stayed. That's braver than anything." The words settled into Rosalind's heart, warming her against the November chill. She had spent so long thinking of survival as mere endurance, the simple act of continuing when everything conspired against her. But perhaps survival was its own form of courage. Perhaps choosing to remain, to hope, to love despite every reason for fear, perhaps that was the bravest thing of all. The week before the wedding brought an unexpected visitor. Rosalind was in the morning room, reviewing seating arrangements with Mrs. Crawford, when a footman appeared to announce that a Mrs. Pemberton had called. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Rosalind looked up in surprise. "From the house party?" "The same, miss. She says she has business with you specifically." Rosalind exchanged a glance with Mrs. Crawford, who shrugged slightly. "Show her in." Mrs. Pemberton entered with the same knowing smile Rosalind remembered from that fateful dinner, her shrewd eyes taking in the morning room's comfortable arrangements with evident approval. "Miss Blackwood, or should I say, the future Duchess." I confess I was not entirely surprised when the announcement arrived, though my husband nearly choked on his breakfast. "Mrs. Pemberton." Rosalind rose to greet her. "I did not expect to see you again." "No, I imagine not, but I found I could not let the occasion pass without offering my congratulations in person." Mrs. Pemberton settled into the offered chair with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable in any setting, and without sharing a piece of information that may be useful to you. "Information?" "About Edmund Ashworth." Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew serious. "I heard he fled to America after the unpleasantness at the house party. But before he left, he attempted to call on my husband seeking a loan, or perhaps an ally. My husband refused him, of course, but they did speak briefly." Rosalind's stomach tightened. "What did he say?" "He was drunk, which made him careless. He spoke of you rather ungallantly, I might add, and of his brother, and of his conviction that the Duke's attachment to a governess could not possibly be genuine. He seemed to believe that Sebastian was motivated entirely by guilt and obligation, that once the novelty wore off, he would regret the match." "And you tell me this because?" "Because I want you to know that he is wrong." Mrs. Pemberton leaned forward, her gaze intent. I watched Sebastian Thornfield at that house party. I watched him watching you. I have been observing men and their behavior for 30 years, Miss Blackwood, and I know the difference between guilt and love. Your Duke loves you, genuinely, deeply, and if I am not mistaken, for the first time in his life. Rosalind felt tears prick at her eyes. You barely know either of us. I know what I see, and I see a man who has been dead inside for years suddenly coming back to life. I see a woman who has every reason to distrust happiness, finally allowing herself to accept it. Mrs. Pemberton smiled. I came here today because I wanted you to hear it from someone outside your household. Someone with no reason to flatter or deceive. Sebastian Ashworth loves you. Whatever his brother said, whatever doubts you may harbor, do not let them poison what you are building. The tears spilled over, and Rosalind wiped them away impatiently. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. I don't know what to say. Say nothing. Just be happy. Mrs. Pemberton rose, smoothing her skirts. And when you are settled as Duchess, perhaps you might invite me to tea. I find I rather like you, Miss Blackwood. It would be pleasant to have a friend at Thornfield Abbey. After she left, Rosalind sat for a long moment, Mrs. Pemberton's words echoing in her mind. I know the difference between guilt and love. She had been so afraid, in some secret corner of her heart, that Sebastian's feelings were merely an extension of his responsibility, that he had proposed because it was the honourable thing to do, not because he truly wanted her. But Mrs. Pemberton had seen what she had been too close to observe, and her words, offered with the frank certainty of a disinterested witness, finally laid that fear to rest. Sebastian loved her, not from guilt, not from obligation, but truly, genuinely, completely. And in 3 days, she would become his wife. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the first frost of true winter painting the grounds of Thornfield Abbey in silver and white. Rosalind woke before dawn, too anxious to sleep, and stood at her window watching the sun rise over the distant hills. Today, everything would change. She would walk into the chapel as Miss Blackwood, governess and nobody, and emerge as the Duchess of Thornfield. The transformation still seemed impossible, a fairy tale she had stumbled into by accident rather than a reality she had earned. But it was real. The dress hanging in her wardrobe was real cream silk and Brussels lace, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. The ring that Sebastian had presented her last week was real, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a family heirloom that had belonged to his mother and grandmother before her. The life stretching before her, full of love and purpose and belonging, was real. A knock at her door heralded Patience, who entered in her flower girl dress, pale blue silk, with a sash of deeper sapphire, looking equal parts excited and terrified. Mrs. Crawford says you have 1 hour before the ceremony. She sent me to make sure you were awake. I've been awake for hours. So has Uncle Sebastian. I saw him pacing in the library at 5 o'clock this morning. He looked like he might be sick. Despite her own nervousness, Rosalind laughed. He is not the only one. You're not having second thoughts? Patience's voice held a thread of anxiety. You're not going to run away? I am not going to run away. Rosalind crossed to the child, kneeling to meet her eyes. I am going to walk into that chapel, and I am going to marry your uncle, and then I am going to spend the rest of my life being your aunt and your friend and your teacher. Nothing in this world could make me run away from that. Patience's face crumpled, and she threw her arms around Rosalind's neck. I'm glad, she whispered. I'm so glad you stayed. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. The chapel was filled with candlelight and flowers when Rosalind finally made her way down the aisle, her hand tucked into the arm of the elderly vicar who had agreed to escort her in the absence of any male relatives. The guests were a blur of faces, some friendly, some curious, some clearly skeptical of this unconventional match. But Rosalind barely noticed them. All she could see was Sebastian. He stood at the altar in his finest clothes, his dark hair carefully arranged, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And as she drew closer, she saw something she had never expected to see on that controlled, careful face. Tears. The Duke of Thornfield, who had not cried at his parents' funeral, who had maintained perfect composure through every tragedy and trial of his adult life, stood at the altar of his family chapel, with tears streaming openly down his cheeks. "You came," he said, when she reached him, his voice rough with emotion. "I kept thinking, I kept being afraid. I'm here." She reached up to touch his face, wiping away the tears with gentle fingers. "I will always be here." The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and solemn vows. Rosalind heard herself promising to love, honour, and cherish. Heard Sebastian's voice break slightly as he pledged the same. She felt the weight of the ring sliding onto her finger, felt the vicar's blessing fall over them like a benediction, felt Sebastian's arms around her as they kissed for the first time as husband and wife. And then it was over, and she was a duchess, and the chapel erupted in applause. The wedding breakfast was a grand affair, the dining room filled with neighbours and tenants, and the few members of society who had been brave enough to accept the invitation. Toast after toast was offered to the Duke and Duchess, to their health and happiness, to the future of Thornfield Abbey. Sebastian bore it all with reasonable grace, though Rosalind caught him glancing at her frequently, as if reassuring himself that she was real. It was late afternoon before they finally escaped the celebrations, retreating to the library, their library, the place where everything had truly begun, for a few moments of quiet. "How do you feel, Your Grace?" Sebastian asked, drawing her into his arms. "Strange." Rosalind leaned into him, savouring the warmth of his embrace. "Like I've stepped into someone else's life and found it fits perfectly." "It is not someone else's life. It is yours. Ours." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I have been waiting all day to have you to myself." "You have me now." "Not quite." A shadow crossed his features. "There is something I must tell you. Something I should have said before, but the timing never seemed right." Rosalind felt a flutter of unease. "What is it?" Sebastian released her, moving to his desk and withdrawing a folded document. "After you arrived at Thornfield, after I learned what Edmund had done to you, I made inquiries about your family, your history. I wanted to understand how you had come to such straits. My father was a vicar. He died without savings. I became a governess because I had no other options. There is little more to understand." "There is more than you know." Sebastian handed her the document. "Your mother, did she ever speak of her family?" "Rarely. I knew she was estranged from them. Some scandal, she said, that happened before I was born. She never provided details." "The scandal was her marriage to your father." Sebastian's voice was gentle. "Your mother was born Helena Ashworth. She was my father's youngest sister." The document slipped from Rosalind's nerveless fingers. "What?" "She ran away to marry a penniless clergyman when she was 17. My grandfather disowned her immediately. He forbade any member of the family to contact her, and after his death, my father maintained the estrangement. I was only a child when it happened. I have no memory of her at all." Rosalind's mind reeled. "You're telling me we're related?" "Cousins." Sebastian's eyes held hers. "When I investigated your background, I discovered the connection. I should have told you immediately, but you were still deciding whether to trust me." The realization clicked into place. "That's why you believed my story so easily. Why you offered me employment without real hesitation. You knew I was family. I suspected. I did not have confirmation until after you had already proven yourself. He reached for her hands. Does it trouble you? The connection? Trouble me? Rosalind stared at him. Sebastian, you've just told me I have family, that I'm not alone in the world, not entirely orphaned as I believed. How could that trouble me? Some might say the relationship is too close. Third cousins, barely a relationship at all by the standards of the aristocracy. She shook her head, wonder slowly replacing shock. My mother was an Ashworth. I have roots here, real roots, stretching back generations. I belong here not just because you chose me, but because you were always meant to be here. Sebastian's voice was soft. That is what I believe. When you arrived at my door, lost and deceived and desperate, I thought I was doing a duty, atoning for my brother's sins. But now I think you were coming home. Rosalind felt tears sliding down her cheeks again. She seemed to do nothing but cry lately, though these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. You should have told me sooner. I know. I was afraid you might think my proposal was motivated by family obligation rather than genuine feeling, that you might doubt my love. I could never doubt your love. She reached up to cup his face, gazing into the grey eyes that had become the centre of her world. Not after today. Not after seeing you cry at the altar like a sentimental fool. He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and pulled her close. I am a sentimental fool. You have made me one. Then we are well matched. I have been a fool for far longer than you. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, husband and wife, holding each other in the library where they had first begun to understand what might be possible between them. Outside, the wedding guests were finally departing, carriages rolling down the long drive toward homes and gossip and the ordinary business of living. But for Rosalind, for the Duchess of Thornfield, née Blackwood, born Helena Ashworth's daughter, ordinary life was finally, beautifully over. In its place was something extraordinary, a love she had stopped believing in, a family she had never expected, a future bright with possibility. Come, Sebastian said at last, drawing back to look at her. Patience is waiting. She was very insistent that we not miss dinner, something about a special dessert she helped cook prepare. I suspect it will involve beetles. Almost certainly. He smiled, tucking her hand into his arm. Welcome to your family, Rosalind. I hope you are prepared for the chaos. I have been preparing for chaos my entire life. She smiled back at him, her heart full to bursting. I find I am rather looking forward to it. 7 years later, the nursery at Thornfield Abbey was never quiet anymore. Rosalind stood in the doorway, watching the controlled mayhem with a smile. 3-year-old James had gotten hold of his older brother's wooden soldiers and was conducting an enthusiastic battle across the carpet. 5-year-old Edward was attempting to reclaim his troops while simultaneously defending his position behind the nursery sofa. And 18-month-old Helena, named for the grandmother she would never know, was todding determinedly toward the chaos, drawn by the noise and movement like a moth to flame. Edward, let your brother play with some of the soldiers. James, give the cavalry back to Edward. Yes, that entire regiment. Helena, come here before you get trampled. The children obeyed with the cheerful reluctance of the young, and Rosalind scooped her daughter into her arms, settling into the worn armchair by the fire. Helena immediately began exploring her mother's necklace with sticky fingers. You should let the nursemaids handle them. Rosalind looked up to find Sebastian in the doorway, 15-year-old Patience at his side. Her husband was dressed for riding, his dark hair silvered further at the temples now, his face softened by years of happiness. Patience had grown into a striking young woman, poised on the edge of her first London season, beautiful and confident and utterly beloved. I like handling them. Rosalind smiled at her family, her impossible, wonderful family. I spent too many years caring for other people's children. I intend to enjoy caring for my own. Sebastian crossed the nursery, stepping carefully over the scattered battlefield, and bent to kiss her forehead. Patience and I are riding out to the North Fields. The new drainage system is complete. I thought she might like to see it before her season begins, and agricultural improvements lose their appeal entirely. I will always find drainage appealing, Patience said with mock solemnity. You have raised me to appreciate proper land management, Uncle Sebastian. I cannot simply abandon it because society expects me to care only about gowns and gossip. Heaven forbid. Rosalind reached out to squeeze her hand. Go, both of you. The boys and I will manage perfectly well until dinner. She watched them go, her husband and the daughter of her heart, if not her body, and felt the familiar warmth of contentment settle over her. 7 years of marriage, 3 children, countless small moments of joy and struggle and growth. It still amazed her sometimes, the life she had built from the ruins of Edmund's deception. Edmund himself had never returned from America. Occasional letters reached Sebastian's solicitors' requests for money, mostly, growing progressively more desperate as the years passed. Sebastian had maintained the allowance he'd promised, neither more nor less, and gradually the letters had dwindled to silence. Whatever had become of Edmund Ashworth, he was no longer part of their lives. "Mamma!" Edward appeared at her elbow, his skirmish with James apparently forgotten. "May I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." "Patience says you used to be a governess, before you married Papa." He frowned, working through the implications. "Does that mean we could have had a different mother, if Papa had married someone else?" It was the kind of question children asked, innocent and devastating in equal measure. Rosalind considered her answer carefully. "I suppose in theory your father could have married someone else, but he didn't. He married me." "Because he loved you?" "Yes, because he loved me." "But you were poor. Patience says governesses are always poor, and Papa is a duke." Edward's frown deepened. "In the stories, dukes don't marry poor people." "In stories, perhaps not. But life is not a story, Edward. In life, dukes marry whomever they choose. And your father chose me not because of money or position, but because we understood each other, because we made each other happy." She smoothed the hair from his forehead. "The circumstances of my birth, of anyone's birth, do not determine their worth. What matters is who you become, not where you started." Edward considered this with the gravity of childhood philosophy. "I think I should like to marry someone poor when I grow up. Then people would know I was marrying for love." "That is a lovely thought. But the important thing is to marry someone kind, someone who makes you want to be your best self. Poor or rich doesn't matter, as long as you are genuine. Like you and Papa." "Yes." Rosalind smiled, her heart full. "Like me and Papa." James chose that moment to launch a renewed assault on Edward's soldiers, and the philosophical discussion dissolved into shrieks and negotiations. Rosalind refereed as best she could with Helena still in her arms, the comfortable chaos of motherhood surrounding her. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and Patience had retired to prepare for the round of pre-season activities that would consume her coming months, Rosalind found Sebastian in the long gallery, standing before the portrait of his younger self. She had noticed him here before, always late at night, studying the image of the man he used to be. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, when he turned to face her, there was no shadow in his eyes, only peace. "I used to hate this portrait," he said quietly. "It reminded me of everything I had lost. The openness, the hope, the belief that life would be kind." Rosalind moved to stand beside him, threading her fingers through his. "And now?" "Now I see a young man who did not yet know what he was capable of, who had not been tested by loss or hardened by responsibility. He turned to look at her, his grey eyes warm. I am not that man anymore. I never will be again. But I think I have become someone better. You have. Because of you. He brought her hand to his lips. You saved me, Rosalind. You came into my life when I had given up on happiness, and you showed me that it was still possible, that I was still capable of love, of joy, of all the things I had tried so hard to kill. You saved yourself, she corrected gently. I merely showed you the door. You chose to walk through it. Then we saved each other. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face, that she had once seen only in portraits and now saw daily. Is that not the nature of love? Mutual rescue? I suppose it is. She leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart. I never expected this life, you know. When I arrived at Thornfield, I expected to be turned away. I expected the worst, because the worst was all I had ever known. And instead, I found everything. She looked up at him. This man who had been cold and become warm, who had been closed and become open, who had loved her against all reason and probability. A husband, children, a family that chose me when I had no one, a home where I belong. You will always belong here. Sebastian's voice was rough with emotion. You will always belong with me. They stood together in the gallery, surrounded by generations of Ashworths, their joined hands a bridge between past and future. The portrait of young Sebastian looked down at them innocent, hopeful, unaware of the trials to come or the love that would heal them. And Rosalind thought of the woman she had been 7 years ago, standing in this same gallery, looking at that same portrait, wondering what had happened to turn a warm young man into a cold duke. She had not known then that she would be the answer, that her presence would crack the ice, that her love would call him back to himself. She had come to Thornfield expecting nothing, expecting ruin and rejection, shame and solitude. Instead, she had found her way home. Come to bed, Sebastian murmured against her hair. The children will wake early, and I have plans that require energy. She laughed, the sound echoing through the gallery. Plans? Many plans. He drew back to look at her, his eyes gleaming with mischief she had learned to love. I have 7 years of happiness to make up for, and I find I am only getting started. They walked together through the quiet house, past portraits of ancestors and memories of struggles overcome, toward the suite of rooms they shared and the life they continued to build. Outside, the winter stars blazed cold and clear over the grounds of Thornfield Abbey. Inside, warmth and love held the darkness at bay. And in the nursery, 3 children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were wanted, that they were loved, that they would never know the loneliness their parents had escaped. This was the legacy of an impossible love, not just happiness claimed against the odds, but happiness passed on to new generations. Children who would grow up believing in the power of genuine connection. A family built not on fortune or position, but on the foundation of 2 people who had chosen each other when logic demanded otherwise. Rosalind had once written that she was no longer a governess and a victim, but beloved, and finally home. 7 years later, the words were truer than ever. She was Rosalind Ashworth, Duchess of Thornfield, wife and mother and mistress of a great house. She was loved beyond measure and loving in return. She had survived deception and despair, and emerged into a life more beautiful than any she had dared to imagine. She was home, and she would never leave again.